Alexander Darwin is a jiu-jitsu practitioner and the author of the book Combat Codes, which is a novel that took him nearly 2 years to write, but it was certainly worth it. It's one of the best that I've read in the space, and I think every martial artist should read and champion this book. I really enjoyed this conversation and hope you do too. Here's Alexander Darwin.
That's not a toy.
Mr. Darwin, thank you for coming on.
Hey, Chris, how's it going, man?
It's going really
Thanks
well.
for having me.
Thank you, brother. How's everything going with you out in Boston?
It's going pretty good. As I was just telling you before I came on, my back is a little jacked up, so that's the only thing. But it is how it is, you know. Having done jiu-jitsu for a while, we get these injuries and gotta flow with them.
For sure. How long you been training?
So since 2004, and then of course little breaks here and there for injuries, but pretty consistent since then.
Mostly just jiu-jitsu, or you do other stuff as well?
Yeah, gi and no gi, the both. Obviously interspersed with learning the various grappling disciplines. And I had a stint where I was doing Muay Thai for about 5 years. I just didn't really like getting hit that much.
And gi and no gi seem to be completely two different sports. So it's like training two different martial arts.
Yeah, and you tend to get people from various grappling disciplines. Like you obviously get the judokas in the gi coming in and training, and then the wrestlers in no gi. But I love them both. I've been training a lot more no gi recently, though. Just I don't know what it is. Just where I'm at right now.
I think that's what a lot of people are doing now. I prefer it now too, and I was raised in the gi, so it came to a point where it didn't seem as realistic, I guess. The movement and the restriction of the movement seemed to not be conducive to like reality and in fighting. So I really took a liking to going no gi, and then now I pretty much just train no gi.
Yeah, no, I think obviously we could talk about this forever. There's pros and cons to both. As far as the like reality, I mean, like here in the East Coast where I am, like you walk around on the streets and everyone's wearing winter coats in the winter. So in my mind, I'm always thinking like, whoa, it's like the gi. And I'm sure with your students, you've also like messed around sometimes putting on like streetwear, like hoodies and stuff. So there's all the grip stuff. For me, it's just like what's fun right now and not losing the kind of playful, fun aspect to it and changing it up a bit.
I totally like that. So the reason I wanted to get you on is because you authored and created this amazing piece of work, this book called The Combat Codes, which I think everyone who trains should definitely read and champion this book. This book is amazing. And sci-fi books scare the shit out of me because you guys seem to be able to prophesize things and create these things. And then you get a genius like Elon Musk or a Sam Altman who comes along and creates this stuff. And it's like Terminator. But you created this book, and it's really like a mixture of Harry Potter meets The Matrix, meets Gladiator, meets The Ultimate Fighter. It was really a wonderful read. But what was the genesis of you creating this work in this book?
Yeah, man, I'm so glad you like it. I really appreciate you reading it. And yeah, the genesis of it was as a grappler, as a person who's very much into mixed martial arts and a martial artist for pretty much my entire life. Exactly what you said, I've always loved, like the nerdy side of me has always loved fantasy movies and, like Lord of the Rings, all that sort of thing. But, grappling and mixed martial arts always seem to be underrepresented. There's always, the cool stuff, swords and magic and stuff like that. But I thought, how cool would it be if you could have like a school academy setting, but instead of magic, you could have, martial arts, all the different martial arts represented, especially grappling, because that's one thing, especially, in Hollywood and in fiction, you see very underrepresented because it's hard to pull off. And we're seeing more of it now. As with all the grapplers coming in, like Dave Camarillo, I know is working on a lot of the sets, and there's other guys like that are working on sets. So it's really cool seeing that. But I wanted to write a book that really was a love letter to mixed martial arts and to grapplers. And as you know, the world it's set in, if you mentioned like sci-fi writers prophesize what happened, this wouldn't be that bad if this happened, right? Like it's kind of grim in a certain sense, but essentially the world is war with weapons there's been an armistice, and that's been replaced with single combat fights between champions that each nation kind of trains and represents, so that as a champion fighter, you're representing your nation. You can imagine the stakes that we have, like with the UFC. There's obviously like money and pride at stake, but like this is like the entire nation is at stake, like the resources, the land. You can imagine there's like an evolution. So, you know, we have the Olympics, and like that's the various nations competing against each other, and how competitive nations get. And they obviously sometimes try to like cheat with like steroids and doping. But if you can imagine like everything was on the line, what would nations do to their fighters, right? And that's kind of like the thought process I went down. Like, wow, like what would happen if that was the case? Nations would be doing like all their technology and resources would be going to make like the best fighters.
Yeah, and not to, I mean, there's a lot to unpack with this book, but nations are basically priming these kids basically to become warriors and fight to represent the nation with very high stakes. And it reminded me actually of a scene from Troy where Achilles has to fight Boaguius, and like
I love that one.
They settle the dispute between the two warriors, right, which sort of decides the battle. It kind of gave me that feeling of what that would look like. There's a lot of technical components to this story. How did you begin to even put this together? What was the process, and how did you pull it off?
Yeah, you know, people, when I was a kid, it's something that I've always done. I've always written. I've always created stories in my head. But it's one of those things where as a kid, you don't really realize being an author is something that people do. Like, you just think books are just there. You don't think about the actual authors. Like, you read books and you're just like, that's, you know. And so it wasn't until, you know, later in my life that I realized that there's a craft and there's a process to it. And I actually equated a ton to jiu-jitsu and to grappling. You know, people, when they're first starting jiu-jitsu, or they're thinking of starting jiu-jitsu, I think they can be intimidated for a number of reasons, because they just see, you know, the Instagram videos, the TikTok videos of people, you know, doing these complicated movements, especially now. Like our art has gotten so, and it's really cool that it's so complex now, but at the same time, it can be intimidating, I think, to people that don't realize it. There's people like doing omoplatas and barren blows, and like people are like, what is this?
BJJ fanatics.
Exactly. No one sees like the process and the hard work that goes in day out to train. And the same goes for writing. You know, people think that authors just like the first thing they write is going to be really good, and they even have a misconception about like when you write. Like, even an experienced author, oftentimes their first draft will just be garbage, and they'll have to reiterate it and work with editors over a long period of time to craft what comes out as the final product, which is like, again, for new authors can be a barrier to entry, in that they'll try to write something and they'll be like, oh, and they think about other people reading it, but they don't understand that, you know, what they're reading, picking off a bookstore shelf, that has gone through so many drafts and so many iterations, so many edits to get to that point. So again, I see a lot of similarities between that. So I have, you know, how many drafts or books that I've have in a trunk that I never wrote, or in my hard drive in this case, because most of it's on a computer. How many that I've just used to get better, and that I put away and didn't show anyone. And then finally came up with this concept, the combat codes, that I really was passionate about. You know, often they say, write what you're passionate about, write what you know. And in this case, it certainly was something that helped keep me propelled, like day in, day out. Another misconception about like writing it, or just like jiu-jitsu, is it's going to be like you're sitting in a coffee shop looking like artsy, and you have your computer and your notepad and you're drinking your coffee. Come on. It's like, it's a grind, right? Like that, yeah. You feel like what you're writing a lot of the time, day in, day out, is just crap. And you have to just drive through it, just like being on the mats. You know, you don't have, everything is not great. You get smashed a ton, and that's part of the process. The same with writing, and you have to keep chugging along. And that's why it's important you're passionate about something. You can't just be like, oh, what's going to be popular right now? That sort of thing, because it won't come through. So I you know, kept pushing it, and the world of the combat codes was born.
I'm just fascinated in the process, because there's, like I said, there's so many different components to it. There's one point where you're talking about the classes that some of these guys are taking. And I think one was grappling, one was striking, and one was like performance augmentation. And I'm like, what the fuck is performance augmentation? So I went and looked it up. This is like the kind of what we're moving into in the real world, right? Is like this
Mm.
connection with AI and robotics. I'm like, how the fuck did he think of that?
Yeah, I think like looking at the trends of how far we've come with mixed martial arts and how much has changed. Like you're old school. I'm sure you remember the days like watching how fighters would train and they just beat the shit out of each other. Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
think about how far we've come as far as like learning about training camps. You know, learning what works and what doesn't. And even in the jiu-jitsu world, like when you see like new techniques and new systems come online, like leg system attacking the legs. Like I think there was a period there for a few years or several where everyone was getting hurt and they just didn't, they had these new magic powers. And even in the training rooms where they were getting good at it, there was just a rate of attrition that was too high. So again, I think we're in this it's so fun for me. Like I'm not a pro in any sense. Like I've practiced jujitsu for almost 20 years, but I'm not a pro. And I just love observing it and observing how it's evolving and how people are trying to just create more efficient ways. And I think if you picture an imaginary sci-fi world where, again, everything is on the line and all the resources of these nations are devoted to combat, to single combat, unarmed combat, what would happen? So I was just trying to be creative about creating methods of efficiency they might have.
yeah. And another component that really made me that drew me into your book was just the idea of codes. I'm big on codes, and like to the point where I tell people, like, if you don't live by a code, it's very hard for me to respect you, because even if I don't agree with your code, like I can still respect you because you're disciplined in how you live your life. And that aspect of martial arts for sure, but in general in life is kind of in jeopardy to some degree. I mean, I even look at
Mm.
somebody recently in the jiu-jitsu world champion Urbith Santos, going to
Mm.
jail for raping people. And he's in our community and he's a world champion and people look up to him, but he doesn't obviously live by a code. He doesn't live by our code. I feel like we have to regulate our own in a certain way. And just the idea of combat codes and how we live our lives is a huge part of what we do. And what was your approach of just going from the code standpoint?
No, that's a great topic. I could talk all day about this. So I'm a big fan of like many martial artists of like the samurai culture.
Mm.
Of course, we have like Musashi, the Book of Five Rings. I actually highly recommend the fictional book about Miyamoto Musashi. It's called Musashi, but it's fiction. It just follows his story, and it's so fantastic. It was written over 50 years ago, but it reads like a modern masterpiece. It's like
Wow.
it's not hard. It's really intimidating because it's like 1,000 pages. But if you get into it, it's just so good. It follows his. Anyways, there's other works from that era, like the Hagakure, which like again follows a code of Bushido. It has little like vignettes, stories, as well as the actual prescriptive codes. So I was thinking, if there was this society in the combat codes, there's different caste systems. So there's like upper class politicians who kind of pull all the strings, and then there's the Grivar, who are the samurai. They are fighting for everyone else. They're one of the codes is we fight so the rest shall not have to. So they're fighting in the place of wars. Of course, it's not as simple as it is. They're kind of being used by these politicians. The old school Grivar follow this code of honor, and that's what the combat codes are. And each chapter has kind of a preamble to it that you get a glimpse of what the codes are. And again, they're heavily inspired by like the samurai codes, like Bushido, living a very Spartan life. And again, these guys are and girls are very hardcore. You can imagine they're fighting for their life or death. Their entire life is devoted to this, much like the samurai. So a lot of the codes are prescriptive of removing all the technology. They're not forbidden from using technology, even transportation, in the fear that it would be harmful to their skill and their mindset. And so I do think that's like a really important part. And of course, in the book, there's this conflict between the newer fighters and the old school fighters, where the newer fighters, just like you're talking about, are losing touch with that way of life for any number of things: money, greed, power, lust, all those things. And I think in reality, as an author, I try to, it does really disappoint me when we see people from our community acting just so terribly. It gives a bad name, and we see it all the time. As an author, I look at everything almost from a story perspective, because that's what humans do. We tell stories, and we're telling our own story all the time in our head of who we are. And I think some people, they just seem to gotten lost. And I mean, one thing that I remind myself is, if you're writing a villain, even the villains, they're telling themselves they're the heroes, so that they're telling themselves a story in their head where they don't necessarily think they're the villain. They're lost. They've become lost on that path.
It wouldn't be an actual bad idea if we did have actual codes in jiu-jitsu, in martial arts, to having some sort of navigational system. Because as you said, as money comes in, as industry comes in, it's a very strong industry now, but it's a strong industry because we've had a strong culture. And now as we move into this new phase of people can actually have these things, the lines can get blurry, right? And so in order to maintain good ethos and good ethics in what we do, it wouldn't be a bad idea for some people to get together and put together a list of things that we should push out into our community.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it's just so hard to gel across so many different factions. Like, even in the jiu-jitsu community, we have many different factions.
Yeah.
Gi and no gi. Like, obviously, we're all practicing grappling, but there's just so many factions and politics, in a sense. Not even in the sense of politics for a nation or for international politics, but politics within the communities. That's not where I just write the stories. I'm not a person that would be able to put that together.
So what makes a good story?
So the two main characters in the combat codes, and I can use that to kind of illustrate what I don't want to give myself too many.
By the way, if you make the movie, I want to be Murray. Just so you know.
Hey, I can't talk about it right now, but there are some wheels in motion. And I'll put your name in, Chris.
Well, you let me know. My beard is going gray, so you just let me know.
No, if it's either you or Bautista. Is he a brown belt? I'm going. Yeah. We could go with you. No.
I'll fight Bautista for it.
So Murray, speaking of a good role for Bautista, Murray is like this older ex-champion who's kind of disillusioned. He follows this old code of conduct, and he's kind of disillusioned with the current system. And he finds this gem in the rough, this young kid who has a lot of promising talent. I won't give away any spoilers, but like, he's kind of a prodigy, this kid Seago. And Murray, just like, if you've ever seen any of these stories like The Last of Us or The Witcher, they help each other. It's like kind of the lone wolf and cub relationship where, Seago helps Murray refine his honor. And Murray, of course, acts as a mentor figure for Seago. And I think what makes, not to ramble too much, but I think what makes a story good, in a sense, are stakes. Like, if you were to pinpoint one thing, like, you could, especially as far as action, like Combat Codes has a ton of fighting, ton of mixed martial arts. But if I were to just write like a play-by-play of fights, it would read very dry, no matter how passionate you are. And I've had a ton of people who are into jiu-jitsu, into mixed martial arts, but also people who have no idea about anything martial arts, who have come and said, what resonated with them is the character and the stakes you feel. Like, you want to, as a reader or a viewer of a show or movie, you want to feel something is to be lost. There's going to be something lost, because in our that's what, as humans, that's how we resonate. Like, again, in a fight, if it's just a fight and there's, it doesn't matter who wins or loses, it's not going to affect the trajectory of the narrative of what happens next, then no one cares. No one cares. Maybe I'm getting older, but like, just so many movies nowadays, I just watch them and it's just like action. It's just like laser blasters are firing everywhere, and it's cool. The effects are awesome, and you're like, the characters are really, I think the reason people watch them is because they love, like, Marvel or Star Wars. Like, people just want to hear the character names again and see the characters come back. At the same time, a part of me, as a storyteller, I'm watching like these fights and I'm just like, there's no stakes. It's like, people are getting shot, nothing, it doesn't matter. Like, how does it resonate with the characters?
And I can't help but think, like, if people understood the structure of how to write a good story, they might be able to look at their own lives a little bit differently, and maybe go through hardships, saying that's a part of their own story, and just how they architect their lives.
I think I mean, again, going back to humans in general, I think we are naturally, that's since the very dawn of mankind, we're storytellers. And whether you know it or not, you are a storyteller. Like whether it's chatting with friends, you're telling stories every day. When you go home and you talk to your wife or husband, you're telling the story of your day. And I think it's just about being the ability, just like we started with, being able to put it down in a way that people can enjoy it. And again, I don't want to, there's so many different flavors as far as what the ways to tell stories. And there, some people will say, oh, that movie is really bad, or that book is really bad, but it has an audience. You know what I mean? And like some people are like, oh, romance sucks. Like, I don't read romance books, but there's a ton of people that do. And if they're enjoying it, that's their thing. Like, there's a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah, and when it comes to process, I'm really interested in process. Are there certain things that you need to be in place to get into your creative zone? And talk to us a little bit about, where you might need to be, or some of the tools that you like to use when you're being creative.
Yeah. So as far as writing a novel, there's actually a lot of different parts of it, and they require different parts of my brain. And I think this goes for a lot of authors. So like, drafting is essentially creating something from scratch. So that's like the equivalent of getting your raw materials, or your paint, or your clay, and just starting to do the molding of what is to come. And so drafting is the most typically like creative part of the process, in that for me, when I'm drafting, I do need to be in that kind of flow state. I need to have a rhythm. It takes time for me to get into that spot, like some catalytic energy. It takes a little bit of time. It's not, I don't want people to confuse it with like looking for like a muse and some like artistic. It's like, it's a grind again, but it just takes time for my mind to go from like taking care of my kids, doing finances and like stuff like that part of the brain, to going to like creating more of a subconscious part of your brain. When you see authors, a lot of times they'll be like going on traveling and going on walks and stuff. I think that's just a way to like tap into your subconscious. It's all just coming, like, you're like, if you think too hard, it's just like jiu-jitsu. If you're thinking too hard on the mats, oftentimes that's where you're going to hit a barrier. But then there's like editing, which is like you're taking your initial draft and then like analyzing it. And that's a different part of the brain. That's like analyzing the structure, not even to the level of like grammar, but like, does this make sense from a character perspective? Does the story, is there plot holes here? I can do that more like interchangeably with conscious activities. Like I can jump to taking care of my kids, to editing, and then back. Whereas drafting, it's like, I kind of need my space. Like, I need a few hours to be carved out to be able to do that.
And are you listening to binaural beats? Are you sitting in front of a window? What kind of programs are you using? Stuff like that.
I've tried all sorts of stuff as far as programs. There's stuff authors use, like Scrivener is one where you can like really organize.
I love Scrivener.
I've tried it. I've like done a lot of trial and error. The way my brain works is like, I'm pretty disorganized. And if I try to organize, for example, like some authors are known as outliners, whereas some authors are known as more like pantsers or gardeners. And I'm more on that end, where if I try to outline too much and I plot everything out like with bullet points, and using a program like Scrivener and try to put everything in the neat boxes, it kind of like, that is the process, and I lose touch with it, and I get bored. Like, the fun part of drafting is actually just having that blank paper and writing it. And again, if I outline, it's like I already used up that the energy to outline. So I mean, who knows? Maybe I can change. It seems like it would be a lot easier to be able to do that.
So instead of like reverse engineering the plot, you're sort of,
I'm just going.
You're flowing and you're spitballing and you're going, and then you just
like nowadays I try to, I mean, like I'm working with a big publisher, and like if I need to make a pitch, so I can't totally like pivot and be like, this is a fantasy novel actually. So I have to like have point A, point B, point C, point D. But then when I'm writing, I'm more just like flowing, and oftentimes the characters, like, they will lead the way, like they become their own entities. It sounds a little crazy, and they will like surprise me, which is a little bit fun. That's the fun part of getting surprised by your characters. Like, oh, they actually did that.
Are you drawing from a lot of references as well? Like I couldn't help but think that at one point they're, Seago's fighting and he's on the back and he gets dropped on his back, which reminded me of Marcelo Garcia in the ADCC getting thrown on his back by Rico
you
Rodriguez.
got it. You got it. I love that BJJ practitioners know that one. No, that is a direct homage to Marcelo Rico Rodriguez, right?
Okay.
Oh man, what a fight! That anyone listening who hasn't watched that, go on YouTube, look up Marcelo Garcia versus Rico Rodriguez. That's like one of the classics.
And then learn how to jump off somebody's back immediately.
Yeah. Yes, that's not what is advisable. I'm glad Marcelo was okay after that. I mean, like, yeah, definitely takes, whether subconsciously or consciously, from a lot. Again, I pay homage to a lot of classic MMA fights and fighters. Like, there's little Easter eggs in there where you'll be like, oh, that's like kind of like this trainer or this fighter for sure. And so, but I didn't like have the materials like in front of me. It was kind of like I'm writing a scene and it just kind of fit.
Yeah. And then weaving in much less of what I know about is technology. And there was a lot of sort of technology references in there, having to do with light and different elements at play. Where did all that come from?
Yeah, so in the combat codes, all the fighters are competing within what are called circles. It could be like, you can either see it as magic or technology, like kind of like Star Wars. Like, what is a lightsaber? Is that magic? Is it a magic sword? Or is it technology? They don't really explain it. I'm not the type of sci-fi writer who has like a science mathematical background, so don't expect like a deep explanation of how those elements work. I just would consider it magic. There are these circles that affect the fighters in different ways. So one type of circle might make a fighter influenced by the crowd more easily. Like the jeers and the cheers might send them in a certain direction. Or another type of circle might fill them with rage. And like, how can that help them? Like if they're an experienced fighter, they can control the rage and use it. Whereas if they're kind of like a newbie, then or a neophyte, like they might it might throw their game off, as we see in mixed martial arts all the time.
I was just going to say.
And, yeah, it's like, and that's actually where that concept came from. Again, taking the current state of mixed martial arts to the next level, whether it be futuristic or just like a parallel universe. You see how I always thought it was very interesting in sports in general, how crowds affect athletes. Like, it's so interesting to see some athletes like really use rage to their advantage. But some athletes can't do that if they're not like cool as a pickle, like, Ryan Hall, our friend, or Gunnar Nelson. Like, some of these guys go in and they're just like, they might as well be going to like get tea with their grandma. Like, they have the same face. It's amazing. Like, and I've never been like a regular competitor. Like, I've competed in grappling, like knowing how my brain is responding to the more intense competitive environment definitely went into that as well.
I think all the participants who were warriors in the book are kids, right? 10, 12, 13. Why did you decide to make them so young?
Yeah. So again, thinking back to how when, like the big sports in our culture now, they think about the age they train them from, even mixed martial arts now. Of course, in the US, we have like a very strong wrestling culture, and the age that to be a good wrestler starts at age like 4 or 5. And now we have the jiu-jitsu prodigies like Ruotolo brothers, all Mika Galvao, all those guys. They're starting when they're like, I don't know, like they're just starting when they're born, pretty much. Yeah. And so if you were to have a competitive environment, like anything, like ballet or like Olympic sports, the nations, they start the kids as early as possible. So I wanted to set it in a place where their minds are still forming and they don't know. I think that's why we have a ton of books, very popular books like Harry Potter or the Hunger Games or any of these books, because it's an interesting period of a teenager's development where they're deciding what's good, what's bad. They're just picking, which crowd they want to hang out with. And it's interesting, especially in a martial arts school environment, to set these characters.
So this is obviously going to be part of a series for you.
Yeah, no. It's a trilogy. So Orbit Books bought the trilogy. So the second book will be out December. First book is available in bookstores now. The second book is already in the can. So December, before the holidays, will be out. Cool. And then the third, hopefully next summer. We'll see if the time I can get to write.
Yeah, well, brother, this is mandatory reading for everyone in jiu-jitsu or martial arts in general, and it's just an amazing accomplishment, and I wish you all the best with this, and I can't wait to read the second one.
Yeah, man, I'm going to send you an early copy. I appreciate you having me on, man.
Appreciate it, Alex. Thanks so much.
Thank you.